Hey everyone, last week Fujifilm dropped off this camera for me here. It is the X-T100, just another camera in the line of their X-T series cameras. And it's sandwiched somewhere between the X-A5 and the X-T20. Now, while it shares a lot of the internal mechanisms and guts of the X-A5, it's actually better to think of this camera as an X-T20 that's pared back a little bit. And the reason is because this is a consumer camera. It is not a pro camera. In fact, it's probably the first consumer grade product I've actually had to review. And when you look at the X-T20, what they've done now with this camera is stripped out a lot of those pro features like the X Processor Pro, but they've left a couple really important things, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the theme here is when it comes to consumer electronics, consumers who are just going out to try to get good photographs and not necessarily in professional settings are not looking for a lot of the bells and whistles that pros use to do their work. And so they can save a lot of money, but still get the feel of a professional camera. This camera is really a product of modernity. And what I mean by that is it's really designed for people who are typically shooting on their smartphones and are ready to move up to a camera that can improve the quality of their image. And that improvement usually comes in the way of a larger sensor, so an APS-C sensor in this guy, a more powerful processor of course, and then interchangeable lenses to get maybe a shallower depth of field through a wider aperture or a longer lens on there, whatever you want to do. But it's in the interface that really feels like it's adapted to smartphone users. And they do that in a number of ways, but mostly it's just about taking the complexity away from photography and making sure that it's more just plug and play. You turn it on and it's ready to go, and it takes photographs just as good, if obviously not better, than your smartphone. There's a bunch of other features as well that we're going to cover. So before we get into all this, what I'd like to do is first cover what I like about the camera, and then I'm going to cover some of the challenges that I find with this camera. Okay, first up is the body. Now this is what makes it more akin to the X-T20 than the X-A5, where the X-A5 had a plastic body. This is full metal jacket, kids. And why that's important is not just the feel of it. I mean, it feels like a professional camera, and as a consumer, it's nice to feel like you're holding something that is built tough. The second thing is its durability. And I can tell you this because I'm super clumsy. And sorry Fujifilm, but I did drop this camera 3 times on the sidewalk. Definitely not intentionally. It did slip out of my hands. They did give me a strap with it, which I chose not to use. But there was only some small damage to the camera. So I did put a couple marks on the eyepiece here and a couple little small gash marks on this dial. But other than that, camera works perfectly fine. It doesn't really look that damaged. You have to really look close to see it. And I can tell you that even as a consumer, you're probably going to be just as hard on your gear as a professional. I mean, you can drop it just like anybody else can drop it. And if you're out doing a lot of different fun things, the chance that you're going to drop it is probably pretty high. So having something that is really beefy is really important. Another win for me with this camera, to nobody's surprise, is image quality. Fujifilm has always been at the forefront of image quality, and they've sacrificed some other things just to deliver a really, really good image. And that's why people are so loyal to Fujifilm. This 24.2 megapixel sensor is very similar to the ones found on the X-A5, but it's not just in the megapixel count that's really great, it's also in its low light ability. You'd think that with a camera with not a pro processor and not a pro sensor, that you'd suffer a little bit in low light. But up to 6400, I was really happy with the image quality in the stills. I didn't really get to test it for video, but the stills was great. Another important thing to note is at the time I was testing this camera, I wasn't able to edit the RAW files. They weren't compatible with Lightroom or anything, so I could only work from the JPEGs. And I was actually quite impressed, as always with Fujifilm, that the quality of their JPEGs has a lot of latitude and a lot of push around with them. So you can pretty much just set it on JPEG for the most part and go and have some fun and not really worry about the weight of raw images. Next up is the LCD. Fujifilm has always been really great about designing really good LCD screens, and they were one of the first, of course, to be able to do a screen that does this, as well as a screen that will do that, and a screen that will do that, but they've added to it, similar to what the X-A5 was sort of leaning towards as well, with a selfie mode. And that's where, again, this camera is really designed for smartphone users. It's really great in selfie mode. So not only does it have this great articulating screen that goes in pretty much just every direction, but you can operate a lot of the camera just with touchscreen, and it's got a couple other really cool features like burst modes, which we'll talk about in a bit, that allow you to really operate super well in this sort of selfie mode, which is great. Up next is its autofocus. One of the things, of course, that I do miss in this camera that you get with the X-T20 and above is the X Processor Pro, which means that the autofocus and the burst modes and all these things are super tack sharp and really responsive. But that being said, even though it doesn't have the X Processor Pro, it does have really good autofocus. It has actually a lot of the same autofocus features firmware-wise that the X-T20 has. And I didn't really find that the autofocus lagged at all, and I found it was pretty much just as good at tracking an object. In fact, one of the great things that makes this so good for, say, smartphone photographers is they have this mode called SR mode, SR Plus, in fact. And this is really great for smartphone users moving into a mirrorless camera for the first time because it does a couple things that are really, really cool. One is that it evaluates the metering and the exposure in a much better and more complex environment way than traditional, say, auto or P mode would. So you can shoot in more complicated environments exposure-wise and get better results. The second is its tracking. So it auto tracks a subject in the scene. It kind of figures out what is your subject. And I think your subject is this, and it's pretty accurate. And it will track that subject as they leave the screen, come back into the screen, sort of recognizes it, makes a stamp on it, knows what it is, can come in and out, and it always locks onto focus. A very impressive feature for a consumer camera. And I think that for smartphone users, this is great. It just really strips away a lot of the complexity when shooting and having to worry about focus and exposure. Another thing that moves this camera into more of a smartphone world is that Fuji does not supply a battery charger with it. They want you to really just plug it in just like you do with your smartphone. So it comes with a USB-C style plug. You plug that into the wall, into the camera, charge it overnight, and you're good to go. It does, however, come with a battery that's similar to the X-T2, X-T20. You get about 470 shots with this guy, and if you want to buy an aftermarket charger, say you have multiple batteries for whatever reason, you can still do this. This is a very common FujiFilm battery. And it's also in this compartment where they put the SD card as well, so it's not on the side. And finally, the other sort of plus for me with this camera is a bunch of the cool features that I alluded to earlier, which is in their burst mode. So in their burst mode, you have a couple things that will recognize smiles, it will recognize your friends, it will recognize a face. It does a lot of really cool things, and it also has a panorama mode, which I thought was really cool. So just like your smartphone, you can do panoramic photography with your smartphone. You can do that just with this guy and presumably get better images out of it, better than your smartphone in terms of image quality. Overall, I think consumers are really gonna like having this sort of beefy feel to it. They're gonna feel like they have a pro camera, and they have all the features that they'll ever need, trust me, in a consumer model. With all that said, here are some of the things that I find most challenging with this camera. First up is the button and dials. Traditionally, I've been a real huge fan of Fujifilm's design. They aren't cluttery, the dials and the buttons are all in the right places. It's really intelligently designed that way, making the user experience really incredible. What they've done here is, it does feel very similar to the rest of their cameras, and I'm happy about that, but they've done some things that confuse me a little bit. One is that they've taken a lot of the dial set markings away because they want you to basically make it your own. So you can go into the system and you can assign this to be whatever you want, assign that to be whatever you want, very simple things. And it's a really cool feature, but what happens is that while I was able to sort of replicate as close as I could the X-T2 or the X-H1 with ISO there, when it came to shutter and aperture, I really didn't know what to do, and I made this shutter and I made this little guy aperture, and this is really small, and I'm used to this being shutter, but now this selects modes. It was all quite confusing for me, and I never got the hang of it. Even after a week of shooting with it every day, I felt it was cumbersome and weird to like get, do I use my thumb on this? Do I use my finger? I don't know. So I wasn't super psyched about that. That might just be that I'm so used to their pro cameras that this is weird for me, but where a consumer may not even notice. But that was one thing I didn't really dig. The second beef with this guy is, while they call this a 4K camera, it's not really a 4K camera. It shoots 15 frames a second at 4K, just like the X-A5. So that's a bit of a bummer. 15 frames a second isn't something that looks good. It kind of looks like a slideshow. I think that's more designed for the ability to extract frames at about 8 megapixels, because this is a 24 megapixel camera. but also that you can do time lapse though at 30 frames per second in 4K. So if you want to do 4K time lapse, then this camera works awesome at up to 30 frames a second. But here's the other issue with video on this guy is it does shoot super slow motion at 100 frames per second and then conforms it to whatever timeline you want. Although it doesn't conform it to 24p for some strange reason, only to 25, yet the system is set up to shoot 24. So it's not a PAL versus NTSC thing, it's just a thing. And as you would expect, as you get with a smartphone, there's a lot of moire and a lot of image artifacts when it comes to shooting in super slow motion. So, you know, it's kind of a novelty for me if it doesn't have a lot of moire. But what was a surprise to me was that the other frame rates and resolution. So at 720 or 1080p, at 24 or 2398 or 2997 or 5998, lots of moire. I'm pretty sure my smartphone doesn't even have as much moire as this had in 24p. So that was kind of a bummer to see. But again, it's not a pro camera. And if you're not pointing at tiles or fences or shingles, probably won't even notice. So for a consumer, does that matter? Probably doesn't matter. My last little beef with this camera is that I do miss the X Processor Pro, and that's just because I'm so used to it. And while 6 frames per second in burst mode is pretty good for a consumer, I'm used to a faster burst mode. I'm used to just more options. When it comes to the menu, it has the old style menu because the processor can only deal with a more simplified menu. I miss the more modern menus that I get from the X-T2 and the X-H1. So that's a bit of a bummer. But overall, I think the camera is a great camera for consumers. I think it's actually a better camera than the X-A5. And if you like the X-T20, but you don't want to pony up the cash for it, and you're just moving from simple photography or smartphone photography, this camera is a pretty good deal. And for about $900, kit lens included, you get a pretty awesome little package here. Well, that about does it, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, please subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. And please comment in the comments section below. We'd love to hear what you think about this camera, what you think about Fujifilm cameras in general, and what do you think about my clothing? Because people love to comment on what I'm wearing. Until next time, happy shooting.